Good afternoon. I'm Sarah Slaughter, and I know that people are still joining, but we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Sarah Slaughter on behalf of the W. Clement and Jesse V. Stone Foundation and Advance Illinois, and all of the partners who are listed here for this event. Welcome, and thank you for joining. We want to give a special shout out and appreciation to our public sector partners for joining us today. Joining us from the Governor's Office, the Illinois State Board of Education, the Illinois Board of Higher Ed, and CPS. So thank you for taking the time to join us today. So here's the roadmap for our next hour. First, our special guest, Dr. Linda Darling-Hammond, will speak about her national research, both a sneak peek on a soon-to-be released report, as well as prior research on quality principal preparation. After she speaks, Robin Staines, president of Advance Illinois, will follow up with some Illinois-focused questions. You can also put your questions in the Q&A, and Robin will do her best to get to as many as she can. Robin will then hand the baton to a distinguished panel of Illinois respondents. So as you can see, we have a lot to cover. But before I briefly introduce our guest speaker, I do want to take a moment to look around the virtual room because the attendance today speaks to the strengths of Illinois and our collective commitment to excellence and equitable outcomes for all learners. In addition to our public sector partners, we have K-12, early childhood, and higher ed. We have teachers, principals, and superintendents, advocates, associations, and funders. In short, we have a big tent, and not just today, but we enjoy a long history in this state, and in fact, on this very issue of principal preparation and its tentacles into so much, into all aspects of learning, including our youngest learners, our ELLs, our diverse learners. So as a state, we have this commitment to equity and a reputation for excellence in many areas. But Illinois, like every other state, is at a critical juncture as we navigate the impact of the pandemic on all aspects of our education system, and our principals have keenly felt that burden. So as we look ahead and we continue our collective commitment to excellence, it is a great privilege to have Dr. Linda Darling-Hammond with us to reflect on principal preparation and what learning matters. I would ask Linda to come on camera now, and I will introduce her. Dr. Darling-Hammond is the president and CEO of Learning Policy Institute, the chair of the California State Board of Education, the author of over 500 education articles, and has been part of 2 presidential education transition teams. So you can see why we are so excited to welcome Linda today, and we are eager to hear what your research tells us about quality principal preparation. So thank you. Take it away.
Thank you, Sarah. It's great to be here in Illinois. Can you hear me? Would you just wave if you can? Because I've had some trouble with my audio, so I want to be sure it's working okay. I'm going to share my screen at this point and very, very quickly review some of the research that we've been doing on principal preparation. Alex, actually, Illinois has a special place in this story that is a very interesting one. And I will try to get to that as quickly as possible. These slides will be available, so I'm going to zip through them. Don't worry about catching any of the details because you can access them afterwards through Advance Illinois, and the report itself will be available. So we've been really building some new research for the Wallace Foundation on earlier research that I did. Some folks may remember in 2007, a team at Stanford worked on the Preparing School Leaders for a Changing World study. We did surveys and case studies and analyses of the literature, and we found that effective principal preparation and development programs could transform principals' practice and increase their success through the ways in which they proactively recruit very instructionally focused educators. We found that the programs that we studied were able to transform the nature of the principalship and who sat in it, such that most of the new entrants were previous instructional coaches. There was much more diversity in the group of educators. They brought in folks who often said, gee, I didn't think I wanted to be a principal. It would take me away from the kids. But when they found out what an instructionally focused principal could be, were very willing and happy to be having the opportunity to go through these programs. To develop and apply strong knowledge of instructional leadership, organizational development, change management, and their ability to get coaching feedback and opportunities for reflection. Internships proved to be very important, and communities of practice. We also found that if you had good preparation, it strongly increased the likelihood of candidates entering the principalship, because in some states at that time, a small minority of the people who got credentials ever went into the principalship. And it strongly increased the likelihood of candidates staying in the principalship, even in high need communities. But the knowledge base that they had allowed them to feel competent, efficacious, and to really stay and end the cycle of churn that often was the case in those schools. In this new study, we reviewed research across all of the studies that have been put out since the year 2000 on principal perceptions, practices, retention, teacher retention, student and school outcomes. We looked at an original analysis of principal learning in relation to outcomes. We did surveys and documentation. We started with more than 1,300 pieces of literature, culled it out according to a set of quality indicators and criteria, and in the final sample reviewed about 96 well-constructed studies that linked principal preparation to specific outcomes. And we found that, again, that principal preparation, when it's comprehensive, and I'll come back to that in a moment, and professional development also when it's comprehensive, positively influence principals' views of their preparedness, their attitudes, their skills, their efficacy, that directly influence teacher satisfaction and retention, which, as we know from other research, actually has an effect on student achievement independently, affected student attendance, achievement gains, graduation and dropout rates. And in a companion study, they found that the strength of the principal effect on student learning is so large that it is only second to that of teachers, and actually works through the ways in which principals enable teachers to be more effective. And what were particularly important elements of this comprehensive approach are the clinical experiences, and I'll talk more about the type of internships, the problem-based learning, having mentors and coaches, and then again, learning not only about instructional leadership, but also about instruction itself, developing people, and a new element in this new research, the ability to serve diverse students well from a knowledgeable stance of equity. This is sort of the model that guides it, and we really saw the importance of both the how of preparation and the what of preparation. Of course, people build on their lived experiences. They are informed by the professional pathways they go through. They're informed by the content as well as the strategies of their preparation and professional development. These are actually linked to measurable behaviors and to outcomes. I mentioned again the elements of the how, and we also mentioned the elements of the what that turns out to be so very important in the comprehensive programs that make a huge difference. We also found, however, that few principals have access to the kinds of comprehensive programs that support their success nationwide. Now, this does vary from state to state, but across the nation, fewer than 10% had comprehensive preparation for their roles as principals. Only about half experienced internships. And many of the internships that people experienced were not designed to prepare them for the principalship, in the sense that they were under the wing of an expert principal, taking on administrative responsibilities, getting specific coaching, and doing that over the course of an entire school year. And just over a third were experiencing the peer observation or coaching that is so important. But policy does influence outcomes. And this is a very important element. This doesn't just happen willy-nilly. We found that this is for secondary principals. We partnered with NASSP to do a survey. We did a second survey with NAESP elementary principals, very similar outcomes. Only 37% had an internship of more than 6 months. Only about half, a little over half, experienced cohort-based learning or field-based projects or problem-based learning approaches. And the kind of internship that made a difference, we found, were those where people could say of those who had an internship that they had responsibility for leading, facilitating, and making decisions, typical of an educational leader, that they were able to develop a leader's perspective on fostering the success and well-being of each student and adult in the entire learning community. That's where, shifting from being a teacher or a counselor or some other role to being the principal means you have to develop this much wider view about the community as a whole. And when the internship was tightly aligned with theory and with coursework. We then also looked at the policy literature, many documents, books, articles, and reports to see what's happening in the policy world. We found that state policy trends have been bimodal across the country, that all 50 states are engaged in policy, but some are pursuing both stronger requirements for programs that really map onto the research, while they're also pursuing alternative pathways. And while there are a growing number of states pursuing the new standards and approaches that I just talked about, the fastest growing sector is online, often for-profit training programs. We saw a stark difference in the way in which these were unfolding in different states, and a stark difference in the way in which people viewed principal preparation as a result of that. In 2005, there were only 6 states that paid attention to student learning in their standards. By 2014, 50 states had adopted ISLIC and at least were mentioning skills to support student learning. Illinois was at the very front of the line in moving towards a much more robust approach to standards. In 2018, of course, the NELP standards were developed that really emphasize equity and clinical practice tied to meaningful coursework more fully. And I understand that those are on the table for Illinois now as well. But as these changes have gone on, the highest leverage policies identified by research have been used by relatively fewer states. These include in program approval criteria, whether they do proactively recruit those candidates, as I described earlier, whether they have clinically rich internships of the kind I described, whether they have those strong district university partnerships, and whether there's regular state oversight with real feedback. With respect to candidate licensure, it depends on whether they had experience in education requirements, an assessment including a portfolio review, license renewal with continuing education. The ones with the asterisks are those that are identified as the highest leverage policies. And only 2 states in 2015, Tennessee and Illinois, met the criteria for all 5 high leverage policies. 5 met the criteria for 4 policies. Everybody else fell in between except for the 11 states that didn't meet any of them. We also found that states are more likely to legislate licensure than program approval, even though the program approval standards do have more of a deep research base. So many of the pundits have cited state exemplars in these studies that illustrate certain things, and you'll see that Illinois shows up twice in this listing, once for its comprehensive approach to standards and funding, and again for the period of time where state funding was put online for quality internships. And we found that the influences of state policy really matter, that what matters about state policy is whether it includes comprehensive content, including the knowledge of development and learning for diverse learners, attention to those things like organizational development, staff development, and change management, integration with that extensive, well-mentored internship experience, The implementation of state policies matter. You all know that. Implementation is the great slip between the cup and the lip. After you've passed a policy, the way you implement it has everything to do with whether it's going to take effect. The degree of comprehensiveness, the degree to which that process is organized, the nature of communication and collaboration with the field matters. And then we found in looking at state policy influences, there are a set of studies that found that the comprehensive changes made in Illinois produced substantial changes in program designs, curriculum, and clinical experiences, and that the earlier changes in Chicago that were a function of programs across multiple universities, and the new Leaders for New Schools program, which had similar designs, were associated with gains in student achievement in the schools that were led by those principals with those kinds of training. So the bottom line is that access to professional learning really matters for principal success and retention, and it matters for that of the students and the teachers in their schools. And so the question for us is whether we can create and sustain the policies that enable that ongoing high quality professional learning. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to find a cord for my computer, which tells me that it is almost out of battery juice.
All right, well, you do that. I'm going to do my little piece before we have a little Q&A, which
That
I'm
sounds
very
good.
much looking forward to, Linda. So charge up. You've charged the rest of us. You should charge yourself. Really appreciate having you. It's great to have you generally, certainly on such an important topic, and let alone with you ending by giving Illinois so many props. We love that. I'm going to do just a couple of quick things to ground us in a little bit of local data before Linda and I do some Q&A. Please feel free to put questions in the Q&A, and I will endeavor to get to those as well. So before we dive into the data, just to pick up on what it is that Linda mentioned, which is that we very deliberately in Illinois made some changes in program requirements. We used to have a Type 75 certificate that was used by everybody, all administrative positions from athletic directors on up to principals and others, and made a decision after 5 years of lots and lots of focus groups. I think there were over 1,000 people who participated from 2005 to 2011, and developed a targeted, more tailored administrative license just for principals and assistant principals. And that's what I think Linda is referring to. So I want to just give you a little bit of data on how's that played out. So over the last decade, and those requirements hit and were required to be adopted by programs out in the field by 2015. The number of principal and assistant principal positions have been relatively flat over the last 10 years. As you can see, the number of assistant principals has actually grown, and it correlates with when new dollars started going out in some places through the EBF. Whether that's what drove it or not, I'm not sure I can say, but flat, pretty stable number of principal positions, some growth in the assistant principal. And Jose, if you'd hit the next slide. And what's happened to our supply? So the blue charts are when we had the general Type 75, which covered lots of administrative positions. The orange is the supply that we're getting, the number of people who are earning certificates that are targeted and tailored for principals and assistant or associate principals. We've seen an uptick in the last 3 years, dropped in 2018. I cannot tell you why, I wish I could. One of the things I'm sure you're wondering is how does that map with how many principals we're hiring in a given year? We usually hire between around 350 to 400. I believe last year it was 356. And I believe we also placed 450 assistant principals last year as well. And if you pull all that together, what the next slide shows is what is the vacancy rate that we're looking at for principals. That too has remained relatively stable over time. At generally less than 0.5%, sometimes by a great deal less than 0.5%. A little bit different if you click again, Jose, for assistant principals, you've got a little bit more variability there, though again, our vacancy rate has stayed below 1%. So that's just some of the background of the circumstance. There is one other data point that is of great interest, I think, importantly so. If you'll go to the next slide, Jose, which is how does the diversity in our administrative positions reflect the diversity of our student populations? We talk a lot about the fact that we need a more diverse teacher pool. The same thing is true at the other administrative levels. So we've got a long way to go before the demographics of who's sitting in assistant principals and principal seat matches those of our students. But it is interesting and worth noting that assistant principals and principals are more diverse, more reflective of the student population than some of our other leadership positions and teaching positions. And what's also noticed, and I'm going to ask a question to Linda about this later, is the state has really done a couple of things, I think, to try to impact that. One, they've set up an Office of Leadership in the State Board of Education. We didn't used to have. Marty McGreal heads that up. So if you've got questions or thoughts or comments, he's the guy you want to reach out to. And secondly, that we have put some real dollars behind recruitment efforts specifically and retention efforts specifically for principals and assistant principals of color. So with that, Jose, I'm going to ask you to stop sharing the slides. Linda, I'm hoping you're charged up and able to come back on screen so I can ask you some questions. And so I will check on in the Q&A as well, but let me just start. One of the things that has to be top of mind for everybody, oh, we lost you.
I'm here.
I know you're not afraid of the question. There's no question that, but one of the things, obviously, we see those numbers. It's important to know what the data tells us about Illinois, but I think we also know we're all in the middle of, an unheard of set of circumstances with COVID, with the stress of being a school leader is like nothing anybody has ever seen before. And I think there is lots of worry about what may happen and whether or not we're going to lose folks. So I'm going to ask you a two-part question. One, what are you seeing nationally and hearing nationally? And the second all is, what is the relationship with principal preparation? I heard you say, and I thought that was great to hear, that, when you do a good job of preparing folks there, and the missing piece I'm filling in is that they are more successful, they're more likely to stay, that is actually appealing on the recruitment and retention. But is that enough to counterbalance some of the stresses that we may be seeing that may be driving people out? And how would you speak to that concern?
Well, this has been a terrifically difficult couple of years for everyone all across the country. And so, educators are feeling very stressed, and that is factoring in. It is also true that, the salaries for educators have been lagging since the Great Recession back, 2008 to 2012. And there's demand across the workforce for, more resources. What we're seeing is the places where the salaries are going up. A lot of states are raising salaries. That is actually going on now, as it should. Teachers now earn about 80% of other college educated workers. Principals earn, I'm sure, less than that relative to other college educated managers of organizations. That does need to happen if you're going to keep people. And then working conditions matter greatly, figuring out how we're going to support people as we continue to go through this endemic. But with respect to preparation, what often happens in the United States, this does not happen in high achieving countries elsewhere, is that when we get shortages, rather than raising incentives, the incentives being the salaries and the working conditions that people want to experience and need to experience, we often lower the standards. And that has this cycle, this vicious cycle, negative cycle effect, because the less well-prepared people are, the less likely they are to stay. Then we have this kind of churn where we hire people, don't prepare them adequately. They find out that the job is way harder than they thought it would be. They don't have the, for example, year-long internship, or in the case of teachers, the student teaching that would give them legs on their practice and strategies to use, etc. And when that's not there, the turnover rates can become very, very high. And then that churn means that you have to produce more supply every year. So we have higher attrition rates by about 200% than places like Canada, Singapore, Finland, in the education profession, because we, continually deal with shortages in that way, and we don't step up on the supports that are needed. But the better prepared people are, the longer they stay, the less churn there is. And I've seen a number of states turn that around by really investing in preparation rather than, backing away from it in times like these. So I think that that's just a critically important thing. It was so stark. I don't know if anyone in the audience ever read Preparing School Leaders for a Changing World. That's the study we did some years ago, which told a lot of stories of the programs and principals and their training and their experiences. And they were just so articulate about the fact that having had the practice-based experiences they had, the problem-based learning, the internship, the good theory, the content, that they were very enthusiastic about the job and willing to stay. And in our surveys, even in very high need communities, principals trained in these programs were staying longer and expecting to stay longer than folks who were washing out, from other less intensive but less successful programs.
So one of the questions that I'm getting from the group is about alternative programs. And do you have an opinion on that? I guess I'm sort of imagining that what you say is alternative or mainstream. You just want to make sure that those elements of quality are there. But
yeah, I mean,
about expanding
alternative means so many different things. So I don't know what it means in this context for, principals, but when it means some things people are not going to have the opportunity to learn some of the things they need to learn that allow them to be successful on the job, then that's a problem. When all of the features are there and they're supported perhaps in a different way, then I think that you can still get a good preparation.
Well,
and that's really the question, is what's the design that allows that to happen in a way that is also not unsustainable. When you have programs where people have to work all day without any support, not learning from anyone else, doing it all by trial and error on their own, and then take courses in the evening and on the weekends, etc. Something has to give, and quite often what gives us that poor candidate who is just overwhelmed.
Well, let me follow up on that, because one of the programs that was mentioned in one of our questioners was, like taking somebody who's got an MBA. So clearly they have got some leadership training and some background. And I think one of the balancing acts that I hear, not infrequently, is how specific does the content need to be for somebody to be a successful school leader? I mean, how much do they need to? I mean, increasingly, we've got people who have, either young learner, early childhood programs, they've got students with special needs, they've got increasingly, dual language learners, English language learners. How specific does the content need to be, or how much of it is, good leadership skills can really carry you through? So how would you answer about the need for that content specificity?
I mean, the research is very clear. You need to know, if you're going to make good decisions as a school leader about curriculum, about staff support and development, about evaluation of staff, and so on, you need to know the content that is being taught. You need to understand how children develop. You need to understand what's going on when children develop in different ways and may even have identified learning disabilities. You need to understand how English learners acquire the English language, and maybe how they can maintain a multilingual framework at the same time. Many people think that education is kind of akin to babysitting. Like there's a bunch of kids there, and then you just have to manage who goes where and what happens. It is a very complex body of knowledge. And we saw there was a movement to bring folks into education without any training or background. And in contexts where there weren't also very senior, well-prepared master teachers, a lot of bad decisions can be made that end up not being productive for children. So an MBA is a great degree to have. It needs to be augmented with a knowledge base about child development and learning, and about teaching that is appropriate and effective in that context.
I have one more question. I'll ask you quickly if you promise to answer quickly, and then I'm going to kick it over to Dan because we're at time. But I think one of the other pieces that can be hard, there's logistical challenges, right? So, Illinois, we've got over 870 districts, if you can believe it. And many of them are small and some of them are far flung. And, so some of the logistics of things like having internships and being able to find enough placements can be a real challenge. What would you say to people who are trying to, find a balance between the supports that are really going to be critical to success and navigating just very practical realities of being in a big, diverse state, including some pretty far-flung rural areas?
Well, my first instinct is to want to refer you to the North Carolina Principal Fellows Program, where the state actually pays for the internship. Districts get together with universities, they actually help sponsor the internships for a full year under the wing of an expert principal. People are using distance technologies, as you know, very well for Zooming into courses. And sometimes in different contexts, you can also Zoom into mentoring and coaching sessions with someone, you know, over a period of time who has seen you practice and is familiar with the situation. So there are lots of ways to solve these things, but they do require some resources. And there are states that have been stepping up to supplement what districts can provide for those internships with state funding to make sure that those can occur in a productive way. People need to be able to make a living, particularly at the point where you are you know, generally in mid-career. When you take on a principalship, you may have a family that actually needs to have a roof over its head and food on the table. And I do think that, you know, when you look at places like Finland, Singapore, other places I've studied, we did a book called Empowered Educators that looked at high performing systems around the world. They really see investing in educators preparation and covering the costs and paying salaries while people are also getting training as an investment, not a cost, as something that will pay off in the long run over time. So we need to find a lot of different ways to make that possible. There are other models I've seen where people are hired as assistant principals while they're training to be a principal, you know, so that the resources are provided in a variety of ways, but they actually allow that internship under the wing of an expert, doing what an administrator does while the coursework is integrated with that experience. And that is a powerful, powerful way to prepare.
Well, I appreciate it. I know we could have a whole webinar just on some of those, and maybe we will. But right now, I'm going to let you go off camera, and I'm going to invite Diane Rutledge to come on camera. And I'm just going to introduce people as she's coming on. Just gasp with me, if you will. Diane Rutledge was a teacher, principal, superintendent in Springfield District 186 for 30 years. Then for 10 years, she was the executive director of the Large Unit District Association. And look at her. She's got the energy and looks of somebody, I don't know, a fraction of her age. So I don't know how you do it, Diane, but I hope you will bring that witchery to this panel, and I will turn it over to you. Welcome.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Robin. I greatly appreciate it. And I'm delighted to be able to introduce our panel today. These are all educators who've been greatly involved in leadership across our state, and they really represent a nice variety around our state. So first, I'd like to introduce Dr. Zipporah Hightower. And Zipporah is the superintendent of schools of Skokie District 73 and a half. Dr. Michaela Frey is our Tappy is our next panelist. And Michaela is the director of professional learning in ROE 1 in Quincy, Illinois. And next is Dr. Lori Ellish Piper. And Lori is the department chair of the College of Education at NIU. So welcome, panelists, friends. I'm so glad that you're here and that you're going to share your experiences and expertise with us today. So the first thing I'd love to ask you is, you've had this great opportunity to listen to Dr. Darling Hammond. So what really resonated with you? What stuck out that connected to your own experiences? Lori, do you want to go first with that, please?
Absolutely. I think the idea of partnership is vital. We've seen our greatest success in partnering with school districts and building programs that meet their needs, but allow them in essence to grow their own principles. And so within this model, being able to tailor the curriculum to address the specific needs in that district, their priorities, but also to create the kinds of opportunities that Dr. Darling Hammond referred to about putting these principal candidates into leadership positions, like serving as a dean of students, for example, during the 2 years of the program, so that they have an opportunity as they're taking their classes to be doing the work of a leader under the mentorship of a principal. We're also grateful to collaborate with the Illinois Principal Association, where they provide coaches who also provide coaching to these principal candidates. So in essence, they're getting these wraparound services, and that is only possible through partnership. So that's one key idea that really resonated with me.
Great, good ideas. And I'll probably come back to some of those a little bit later too. Michaela, what about you? What did you hear?
Just building on what Dr. Piper said, I would agree. And Dr. Darlene Hammond on the importance of partnerships and the comprehensiveness of those partnerships. It takes a lot of time, energy, clear communication to build a partnership that is beyond a piece of paper, and that you're working closely together to make sure that those aspiring principals have that opportunity to have an embedded internship experience and with a high performing and high quality mentor. And I just think that Dr. Darlene Hammond's work and seeing Illinois working so hard to strive for a comprehensive model is so important to reach all of our schools across the state, whether large, urban, suburban, or rural schools. And it is an innovative way to make sure that we are providing every student in Illinois the opportunity to have a high performing principal within their school, and leading that charge for them.
Great. And Zipporah, what stood out to you?
So the only thing that I would add is just the importance of the depth of knowledge that the resident is able to get during that internship, and making sure that their experience is focused on goal setting, their experience is focused on instruction, but their experience is also focused on leadership, and having a principal at the helm that allows their self to step back, to allow the resident to actually have an experience where they may not do well the first approach, but they'll get the coaching that they need so that they can build that resilience, and so that they can build that muscle memory of what it means to be a leader. And just profoundly keeping in mind the importance the principal plays, so the importance the resident would play on the teachers that they are leading and the teachers that they are coaching, and that they're building their understanding and expertise as far as how important that is.
That's so great. I mean, it just makes me realize about how far we have come when we think about it, from my early days of counting books and, monitoring buses, right? So I think that we have focused on instruction, and that's a great thing. So now to build on some more of this, Michaela and Zipporah, I'm going to ask you the next question, and it is back to this partnership because it is such an important one. So the fact that in Illinois, that our requirement is to have these university district partnerships. And I'd like you to be able to think about, like, have you had that experience of having one? And if you have, then what effect did that really have on your districts or the schools with which you work? Did it increase your workforce? Did it give you a larger pool of candidates? Did it help with the quality of the candidates? Did it actually help with the diversity maybe that we've been striving for? Were they, or were you able to really kind of match what was going on in the program with what your needs were in the district? Just some of those kind of topics. And Michaela, if you can start for us and share that from a more or less a rural lens with the schools with which you work. What's that look like?
Yes, thank you, Diane. I was a very novice and new rural school principal with 2 buildings in 2 towns that were about 9 miles apart. And I had not had the opportunity that we worked to establish. I had a chance to go back to Quincy Public School because this became such a passion of mine to help prepare principals. And when I was serving in Quincy Public Schools, we were so fortunate to really have a strong relationship with Western Illinois University. And through that partnership and the partnerships with other schools across the state and their partnering universities, we were really, I would say, had a challenge, but yet an opportunity to find and recruit principal preparation candidates who were aspiring leaders. And we were able to hire and interview high quality principal mentors and engage in that process closely with WIU and the professors there. It was really a value add. The professors knew those students and educators from the classroom component, and we were able to continue communicating with them to make sure that when they left their classroom and were able to engage in a year-long internship, that within that year, they had a semester of an embedded internship that was outside of their building. The matching the matching process became very vital. And working with WIU and Quincy Public School leadership and central office, we were able to give educators not only in Quincy Public Schools, but in our surrounding rural schools, the opportunity to have PK-12 experiences. And I know Zipporah will share a little bit more about those content and specialized areas that sometimes rural schools may not have that programming. And so by being creative and really leaning into an authentic partnership, that allowed us to serve our aspiring principals in that way. It really caused me to reflect on my first years in principalship and knowing that what I wished I would have known, and being able to go back through that also prompted our region to reflect on some of the stats that Robin shared about the Type 75 certificate and license. And what is it that maybe individuals who have that need for a little refresher if they're going to enter into a principal role? And so just making sure that the partnership was intentional really became our primary goal through continuous communication and keeping the principal interns at the center of it. But we tried to always think of a win-win-win proactively, with a win for that intern so that they were getting the experience and the on-site learning that they needed, a win for the mentor, because you want to, at the end of the day, the mentor is still the principal of their building, and we wanted them to feel that they were set up for success. And then there's this third win of when that teacher leaves the classroom in a rural school, or even in Quincy Public, which has about 6,500 students, any teacher stepping away was presented a challenge of a vacancy. So we wanted to make sure that we worked closely with the district and closely with the university to ensure that the teacher that steps away to have this embedded leadership experience could feel good about the children and the services that she was providing with the substitute. So we were very creative in ways that we could do that. And I think just what it comes back to is partnerships. You had to continue to engage in multiple partnerships to make that really work. And from Dr. Darlene Hammond's approach about, failure to prepare is really preparing to fail. John Wooden used Ben Franklin's comment, regularly. And I think that's something that we just need to continue to think about as we look at systemic leadership, high quality leadership across the state in each and every school.
Such a great point. We'll get bumper stickers with that for all of us to remind us. And Zipporah, what about you've had both urban and suburban experiences. What do those partnerships look like for you?
So my partnerships in the suburban district here in Skokie, I haven't had an opportunity to do principal development and leadership. However, we have partnered with Teach Plus so that we can expand our diversity of our staff. And then at some point we will start thinking about succession planning, but I plan to keep my principals in place right now. They are really good and we don't need to change anything. However, as the executive director of principal quality for Chicago Public Schools for about 6 years, we had very strong relationships with our partners. And I want to just bring into play the importance of the leadership coach at the university level, as well as the partnership across the universities and the programs that we were using. It was extremely important for us to have continuity of services across our programs. And so we were meeting with the programs together, having conversations around data points, having conversations around experiences. And it became relational to the point that we were all owning our residents and owning their experience, as well as leaning on our principal managers for support. And so when you think about how do we do a continued model of service, we wanted to make sure that all of our residents were having not the same experience. They were getting the experience on the needs that they had primarily, but that they had the same levels of support. And so making sure that not only were we bringing in our coaches and talking about leadership, but really delving deep to, if someone was having a problem, identifying who was going to support that person, because we all had initial focus on selection. And we all had initial focus on not necessarily the curriculum that the universities or new leaders or our other partners were doing, but that we all had the same outcomes. And so that we were making sure that across that continuum, we were looking at how are we helping our high school leaders understand early childhood education, and why was the importance of early childhood education? How in our early childhood programs in our schools, what were we doing differently? And how were our leaders being able to influence that work? But then also making sure that, because Chicago is unique as far as how they operate as a school, they already have their own board, if you will, with their local school council, making sure that they understood how to work with the community and having community-led projects. But something else that came out of that at the very end was one relationship, with one university partner, UIC, some work that they were doing with their doctoral students that had come through the program and were now seated principals, being able to go back, and they gave me, I got permission to read some of the dissertations, and being able to say, wait a minute, these things that they're doing inside the school as dissertations are things that need to come back to the district as far as how can we leverage the learning. And so I do hope that they're starting to actually maneuver in that direction as far as increasing the skill sets of other staff because of the learning that they're doing through their program. So it was extremely important to have the partnership because each program was able to learn from each other.
That's such a great point. And it goes back again to the win-win-win, that again, if you're making use of the learning that's going on there, so it benefits the district altogether. You touched on something else, and I'd like you just to expand on this a little bit too. We know in Illinois that we have this comprehensive preparation program. So it does include early childhood that you spoke of, and and I'd like to include in that conversation the English learners and special education. So what does that look like when you have candidates that come from a program like that? And what difference does that make for all of our principals?
It makes a huge difference because we're building our students, and we have to understand who our students are. And so for early childhood education, the example that I would give to my high school residents was when they say, well, why do I need to know this? Well, because you are supporting a community. There are times when you may have a student that's actually pregnant, and you may need to be the one to give very vital information and support and care, and just making sure that the child or the student feels welcome. Mm-hmm. Also, you may have a parent who comes in with a child that is a parent of the school who may have a disability, and they're not recognizing that there's actually like child find and different opportunities within the state to get support before they become school age. And so making sure that all of our leaders, especially since when you get your certificate, you can lead any building. It's not contained to what grade levels you taught, that you need to be able to have a wealth of knowledge and support. When it comes to our EL, because I have a high EL population and I am just thrilled about it, it's really understanding cultures and making sure that we are meeting our families where they are, and that we are thinking outside the box through our diversity lens on how we're going to support them. And so we're building our ability to not just lead, but to lead from the heart, which is extremely important work to do.
That's great. I love that. So we've been talking about preparation, but we also should be thinking about what we're doing in terms of, excuse me, our really retention, our recruitment, the whole concept here of what a leadership continuum looks like. And so Michaela, can you speak to that a bit in terms of, as you were saying earlier, attracting folks to your district, and then how you're able to really plan for that future, all the way from retention through succession planning.
Excellent. Thank you, Diane. Yes. The healthy leadership continuum is very important. Once an aspiring leader enters into the principal role, it's health. We really need to think about what supports are going to be for that new leader in the first 1 to 3 years. And then past 1 to 3 years in our region now, we've really embraced a leadership coaching model that provides all practicing principals with leadership coaching once monthly, whether they are a first year principal or they're in their final year before retirement. And so we've also just really worked to think about how we want to differentiate for our leaders based on their needs. So within that healthy continuum, not only learning opportunities and development opportunities through coaching or cohorts of coaching, but it's also important that we give a space and a place for leaders to have intentional networking with one another. I know that being in a principal or a leadership role in a school is sometimes a very lonely job. And so how can we set up principals with a network of learners as the lead learner to continue? And we tie that back to retention. We've had some of our principals within the last 4 years that have said, without my lead coach, I would have left the principalship through this pandemic. Having the opportunity to have a coach that knows me, we've spent time and energy building that relationship. And I think that we just need to be intentional and strategic and aspire to retiring educators and those leaders to make sure that succession planning can occur. And while I was in Quincy, it was just an excellent opportunity to see young principals or directors of programming for CTE transition into their leadership role. And the Quincy Public Schools and their board was so great because we were able to then maximize and leverage funds while being a fiscal steward to make sure that those new leaders could have a semester or a year with the previous leader to learn some of those components. And so it's really, like we said, Diane, just thinking creatively and how you can build that process. And we're replicating that across our region for our 20 districts in West Central Illinois. And what's important is that we continue just to make sure it's a comprehensive model, just as Dr. Darlene Hammond stated, regardless of how many years expertise or experience you may have, that we're continuing to keep that in the forefront of our minds.
There you go. Thanks. And now I want to bring Lori in. And Lori, I know that you've been working so closely with other school districts in terms of partnerships and internships. So can you speak about that for us? I know we don't have much time left here this afternoon, but we want to hear about those.
Yes, definitely. One of the things that we've done is develop an internship action plan that specifically addresses those areas like early childhood education, English language learners, and special education students, so that that internship action plan is intentionally focused on what's going to happen to make sure that it happens. And some of those kinds of things would be, observations in those settings, interviews with leaders who play those roles, opportunities to learn about the grants or the other requirements that are associated with those bodies of work, so that the internship isn't the same for everyone, nor is the internship just focused on what the individual principal candidate thinks that he or she might do, but it's really giving them an opportunity to be developed and prepared across the continuum. In addition to that, when we think about the internship, they're getting lots of coaching and support. So they're getting that daily coaching from their principal mentor. In addition to that, they're getting the coaching from the Illinois Principal Association from their coach. And then in addition to that, from the university supervisor, they're also getting that support. And so that those layers of support, I think, are really important because it allows the principal candidates to see where they're struggling, see where they need further development, see where they need additional experiences. And it really is taking a very developmental approach and thinking about each of these principal candidates maybe at a different place. But through all of that support and observation and mentoring and coaching, we can help move them forward in positive ways to help them be as prepared as they possibly can be.
That's wonderful. I mean, it does my heart good to hear each of you speak about what this is looking like in reality, putting into practice in your districts and around the state at the university level. I want to thank you all so much for your time and your expertise today. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Darlene Hammond and see if she has any reaction to some of the things that we talked about and any closing comments she might want to make. Linda?
Well, it's just wonderful to hear about so much good practice. I just really appreciate it. I want to just throw one thread that I heard throughout the comments, which is the way in which the standards are being implemented without standardization. That is to say, paying attention to the fit, to the match, to the context in each case. Lori, you started talking about the importance with the Grow Your Own programs of local integration, that people are really being prepared deeply for the context within which they're going to practice. And we know that makes such an enormous difference. And it requires those partnerships, you know, to support that happening. Michaela, you talked about the match between the mentor and the principal and how that's such an important element to be sure that, you know, you've thought about what does that principal need and who is the mentor who can give that to them, who can really support them in that way. What is the experience? I think it was, I may be confused about who said this, but how do we get them the experience that they need, right? And that's again about contextualizing the work so that it really does meet it creates a fit between what the principal in training is bringing and what they can be enabled to learn. And it is the mystery of all education, right? It's bringing, when John Dewey talked about it, he said it's bringing the child to the curriculum and the curriculum to the child. When we talk about adult learning, it's the same thing, building on the experiences that people have, giving them the experiences that will allow them to really prosper. And then Zipporah, you talked about the continuity across programs and the way in which we make sure that there's an approach that everyone is getting what they need, that in fact, you know, we have some reliability. And this is the pledge that we make to children and their parents when they are required by law to send their children to public school, that they will get competent, caring, committed adults organizing their experience for them. So your attention to that, I think, is really, really wonderful. So I really loved the conversation as it unfolded in all of those ways. I want to just leave us with Diane's words that failure to prepare is preparing to fail. And the various ways that you've solved those problems of matching the needs to the context, to the demands that children and their families bring to school, so that we are really getting an increasingly well-prepared, increasingly diverse, increasingly sensitive and sensitized principal workforce for the learners that we have. You know, that is the quest, and it's just wonderful to hear all the ways in which you are succeeding in pursuing that quest.
So great. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.